أرحب بكم ضيوفنا الكرام في اليوم الثالث من فعاليات المؤتمر الاقليمي للتعلم الالكتروني تحت شعار التعلم الالكتروني تعليم للجميع. بإذن الله اليوم راح يكون المحور حول استراتيجيات وتجارب المنظمات العالمية في التعلم الإلكتروني. We would like to welcome our visitors on the third day of the Regional E-Learning Conference 2010 held in Kuwait. Today's anchor will cover the experiences, international experiences under the title E-Learning Strategies and Experiments. We will start with our guest, Mr. Yi Jingjong from Singapore. نبدأ بمحاضرة للمتحدث الرئيسي الكينوت سبيكر مستر يي جينجونغ تحت عنوان مسيرة التعلم الإلكتروني في سنغافورة لمراحل التعليم العام. نبذة بسيطة عن سيدي، هو الرئيس التنفيذي لشركة 360 التعليمية في سنغافورة، وكان أيضا رئيس سابق لشركة أسك أند ليرن الشهيرة لإنتاج المحتوى الإلكتروني والبرمجيات الإلكترونية. Mr. Lee is the executive chairman of 360 Establishment Education in Singapore, and he was also the CEO for Ask and Learn, one of the famous companies in Singapore producing educational content. Welcome, Mr. Lee, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Good morning, everybody. Welcome here, and it's my pleasure to be here in this beautiful country of Kuwait. This is my third time here already, and I'm loving all my trips here. So I bring you greetings from Singapore. That is the map of Singapore. It's very small, about the size of Bahrain, but we have about 5.5 million people squeezed into the little island. So I'll be sharing about. This is what I'll be covering today. I'll be talking about the master plans that Singapore had. Singapore had 3 ICT master plans for schools, as well as the lessons we have learned, and to show some examples of e-learning in schools today. A little bit about the landscape of Singapore schools. We have roughly about 360 primary, secondary schools and junior colleges. They are typically of the sizes of around 1,006 for primary schools, 1,003 for secondary schools, and 1,007 students for junior colleges. So that makes up roughly about slightly over 500,000 students in Singapore and about 30,000 teachers. In Singapore, we follow mostly the Cambridge O-levels, A-levels examinations, although we have started a few schools using the International Baccalaureate, and we have a school that is started by the National University of Singapore doing the NUS Diploma program. We do have a number of private and international schools, and these are intended mostly for foreigners, because Singaporeans, unless you have a special reasons, you cannot go into international schools. And there are also certain restrictions as well. The participants in the school e-learning environment in Singapore, I've roughly categorized them into 3 broad categories. First, we have the government, which of course will comprise the Ministry of Education, the biggest player in the school e-learning market. We have government agencies, for example, the Infocom Development Authority of Singapore, or IDA for short. They are tasked to help private companies to boost up the IT industry in Singapore, as well as to look at government organizations, how they can use ICT more effectively. So they are also very active in this whole e-learning equation, from providing support to MOE, as well as providing support and incentive to local companies to go into the e-learning services. And lastly, we have the Economic Development Board, which in the early days of e-learning in Singapore was very active in providing funding and initiatives to help private companies, but no longer so today. Then we have the schools and teachers, of course, which are the main users of e-learning, and these are the people that actually drive the way e-learning has been used over the last 14 years, which I'll be sharing about. And lastly, we have the industry players, of which I came from. As Dr. Amula mentioned, I started a company called Ask and Learn, which became today the biggest e-learning company in Singapore, servicing about half of all the schools in Singapore. So the sharing that I'm going to do for the rest of this morning is going to be from the perspective of all these different players, and my experience is mostly from that of a private industry provider. So my views are not necessarily the same as the government official views. Before I start talking about the Big Bang in Singapore, which is 1997, when we started our first ICT master plan, before 1997, the Ministry of Education did various small experiments to get themselves ready for the use of ICT in schools. We have a department in the Ministry of Education creating computer-aided instruction for the learning of primary school mathematics, which won some awards. We had accelerating the use of ICT in primary schools, which was piloted in 6 primary schools. The program mostly involved buying of CD-ROMs from some local companies, but mostly from overseas companies from America, Europe, and so on, to see how those can be used in schools in Singapore. And then we had the Students Teachers Workbench, which was a program started before internet was launched in Singapore. So it was a pre-internet kind of system which tried to allow content to be delivered from remote places, from one place to another, to the schools and so on. And then we had a few schools in Singapore that started to use internet. Now, internet came into Singapore only in 1995, officially. Before that, it was only in the university. So once it became commercially available, the ministry tried it out in a few schools and a few small experiments. Then came the Big Bang. In 1997, the then Minister of Education launched this program, which is a 2 billion Singapore dollar program over the next 5 years that focus on 4 key areas. The first is to build IT infrastructure to ensure that every school has at least 2 megabits per second internet access. Every school will have intranet file servers where we can store information. And there was a plan to build a standard learning management system that will be used across all the schools in Singapore. The second pillar of this program is to ensure that every school will have sufficient hardware. For that, they decided, based on the number of students in the school, how many PC labs there will be, the video machines, the video cameras, digital cameras, data loggers, and all these are standard equipments. So you cannot choose a brand, you cannot choose the specification of your computers. The government decided, and based on the timing that they had planned, they will give it to the schools at a certain time. And in order that this hardware were to be used effectively, the ministry also decided to set up a team to build standard multimedia resources that will be shared with all schools to be used. And of course, you need to take care of the manpower side of things. So what they did was that they created IT curriculum to ensure that the teachers themselves are properly trained. Every single teacher must be trained in IT, and they created conferences and so on to expose teachers to IT. Now bear in mind that in 1997, when this was announced, IT literacy in schools was very low, and there were hardly computers in the schools other than for admin purposes. So they had a massive task of ensuring that all 30,000 teachers at the end of the 5 years must know computer, must know internet. So some of the key programs in the first master plan, which I shall call MP1 for short, are, because we are setting up the infrastructure over 360 schools, they divided the implementation into 3 phases. In the first phase, there are 22 pilot schools, and hence you also have what we call the 22 demo IT schools. So many things that are tried out were initially tried out in these selected 22 schools. They were the first to receive all the infrastructure, the first to receive all the computer hardware, the first to receive all the training. And then that later moved to 100 schools a year later, followed by all 360 schools within 2 years after that. And teachers were also given incentive that the ministry will pay part of the purchase of a laptop if the teachers want to buy their own laptop. But otherwise, the ministry will provide a shared PC, 2-to-1 for every teacher. That also started a large-scale education software procurement scheme where the Ministry of Education bought large number of CD-ROMs from overseas, as well as encouraged local companies through various schemes which I mentioned here, the school industry partnership programs and various EDB and IDA grants to spur the creation of content to meet the needs of local schools. There is a project called the School DMR project, which is School Digital Media Repository. Basically, this program is that standard learning management system which I mentioned earlier that they plan to have. So they piloted it with 22 schools where there's a system that was designed. It was awarded to a company to build the system, and then various departments in the ministry built content, and the company also built certain content for this. Now, at the same time that the master plan started, which was from 1997 to year 2002, it coincided with a very interesting development in the industry at that time called the dot-com boom. So it started in America much earlier, but in Singapore, the dot-com fever only started in 1999 when a few companies went on to use internet and became public listed on the stock exchange and became very profitable, or so-called very high valuation. So that spurred a lot of small companies, including myself. I was spurred by all these dot-com things happening around, and I started Ask and Learn in year 2000. And together with maybe about 30 to 50 other companies who are also doing e-learning for the schools. So many companies started at that same time. And because of this dot-com revolution in Singapore, many of the older companies that were building CD-ROM content for the Ministry of Education also moved themselves from CD-ROMs into internet e-learning development. And even our universities and the polytechnics saw that this was something exciting. They also created e-learning systems, and in particular, the National University of Singapore and the Ngee Ann Polytechnic created their own platforms and commercialized it. And I was a beneficiary. I took the systems from one of them to start my business. And there were various schemes from the government that provided incentive for co-development and co-funding of all these innovative ideas for education. That resulted in something. It resulted in many free or low-cost e-learning solutions that are used across many schools in Singapore. Many dot-com companies went to the schools offering free internet use and free content. Because of that, the ministry felt that there wasn't a need to do the school DMR project because it was very costly and it wasn't very effective compared to what the companies were offering. So at the end of the 5 years of Master Plan 1, the ministry achieved basic IT skills for almost all the teachers. They had to go through 100 hours of IT training. There was reasonable, good IT infrastructure for all schools. At the end of 2002, we were already having a ratio of 6.6 students to 1 computer in the primary schools and 5 students in the secondary schools or college to 1 computer, and 2-to-1 for teachers' laptop ratio. And also the ministry decided that there will not be any single learning management system, but rather they will let the schools decide